Okay, you ready to put it all together? This is our fourth lesson in our chapter on biomolecules and biochemistry. In this lesson, we'll talk about how biomolecules carry out an intricate and coordinated array of reactions producing life. Now, in the first three lessons, we essentially talked about the players of the game. We talked about amino acids, 20 common amino acids, L, left-handed amino acids, how they combine, how they are linked together to form proteins, proteins being the functional molecules, the microscopic machines, enzymes and transporters and hormones. We also mentioned briefly that there are nucleotides which polymerize to form nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, which are the information storage molecules in our cells. And we talked about monosaccharides, such as glucose, which can polymerize to form polysaccharides, carbohydrates, such as starch and glycogen, and cellulose. And we talked about fatty acids and how they can be linked together with glycerol and a phosphate group to form something called phospholipids. And we talked about a few other molecules that are in the category of lipids. So those were the players of the game. In this lesson, we want to talk about the game. What is the game and where is it played? Now, basically, we're going to talk about metabolism, but metabolism can be either of two sorts. Metabolism to obtain energy, that is to take the fuel molecules or the food that we digest and to break it down in order to extract energy, that we need to function, energy that we need to do work. That we call catabolism. That is breaking down fuel molecules to extract energy we call catabolism. And we will focus in this session on catabolism. But also there is a whole set of synthetic metabolic reactions that synthesize molecules, and importantly, the molecules listed above, usually from scratch. In some cases, we have to have the precursor molecules in our diet, like the essential amino acids. But in most cases, we can make these molecules just from any fuel molecule that we ingest. The synthetic metabolic pathways we call anabolism. Anabolism means building up. So again, we're going to talk about metabolism, emphasis on the catabolism, the breaking down part. But first, let's give a little context to metabolism and the conditions under which it must operate. Let's consider where life originated and how it evolved. Planet Earth we know to be 4.5 to 4.6 billion years old. The first life forms, evidence shows that they arose 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. And the reason for stressing this is that life originated, of course it was single-cell organism forms of life, originated in the absence of oxygen, what we call anaerobic conditions. That is, data shows that the atmosphere of planet Earth was devoid or very deficient in oxygen. Now, the reason for pointing that out is because, take a deep breath, life as we experience it, our own lives, we depend upon oxygen. So the first life forms developed in the absence of oxygen. Anaerobic conditions. As Dr. Hoeksema will have explained, there do exist anaerobic organisms, and there are metabolic pathways that operate in the absence of oxygen, but that the more efficient metabolism involves oxygen as a reactant with fuel molecules. And so it took about half of the total lifespan of planet Earth before there was an appreciable amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. And this oxygen arose, what is called the Great Oxygen Event, and the oxygen arose due to the action of cyanobacteria, the first photosynthetic bacteria that evolved on planet Earth. That then led to a certain level of oxygen in our atmosphere. And then about 500 or 600 million years ago, there was what is called the Cambrian explosion, followed by the Carboniferous era, in which there was a great increase in the variety and types of life forms on planet Earth, including the first trees, which then, because of photosynthesis, led to a significant increase in the amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. So, we now do have oxygen, and the importance of that is because that metabolism that involves oxygen is much more efficient than metabolism in the absence of oxygen. Now, Dr. Hoeksema, in one of his lessons, described the important characteristics of life, and I'm going to repeat some of these, but from a biochemist perspective. Life involves the ability of organisms to extract energy that they then need to do work. Now, this has been sort of a theme of this course. Energy is needed to do work. Well, the types of work that living systems have to do include finding food, protecting themselves from predators, protecting themselves from the environment. Also, the ability to replicate or reproduce. And of course, in modern times, we do work to earn a salary so that we can go to Kroger's to buy our food so we don't have to go out and hunt it ourselves. But we need energy to do work. Now, all life forms use chemical reactions as a basis for how they extract energy from fuel molecules, which we call food. Chemical reactions, that is, we are not like watches where we have springs that you wind up or gears or pulleys. Metabolism is based on chemical reactions. Another key characteristic of life is that organization is essential. If you take a living cell and you blend it up in a blender, you will have killed the cell, even though you may not have changed the molecular components, but they are no longer organized in the proper way. When you lose the organization of a cell, you lose vitality. Also, and we've talked about this in a few of our other lessons, it's important for biological molecules and living cells to be able to assemble themselves. We talked about how polypeptides, if they have the right sequence, can fold up into functional proteins. We talked about how phospholipids can spontaneously organize to form bilayer membranes, which then become the membrane for cells. Organization and the ability to self-assemble are extremely important. Also, all living forms use a cellular sort of compartmental design to isolate the insides of a cell from the outsides, and even within a cell there are subcellular compartments for further organization of some components inside and outside of these subcellular compartments, such as mitochondria. All of this is important for the cells to function properly. Now, other key characteristics of life are that all life forms use catalysts being enzymes, to speed up the chemical reactions. And that's because all chemical reactions don't occur at the same rate. And we want the chemical reactions to occur in a coordinated manner and in a controlled manner. And so to do that, enzymes both speed up and regulate the rate of chemical reactions. I sometimes say when I'm teaching biochemistry that when we go have lunch and eat a cheeseburger, we don't want to then have an explosive reaction inside of our stomachs. We want the metabolism to occur over a period of time in a controlled manner so that energy is extracted from the fuel molecules. Also, life forms use an information storage molecule of DNA with RNA assisting in the storage and expression of genetic information. This is a strategy that is used, and it's a very key strategy because DNA in particular is a very stable molecule, whereas proteins, because they're microscopic machines, can undergo wear and tear. They can be sort of worn out. They might not fold up properly, or they may undergo some chemical reactions to modify their side chains. And if they get worn out, we can just replace them. In fact, there are some cases like hemoglobin. The proteins of hemoglobin are recycled because, in fact, they get worn out. But DNA is more stable and is suitable for storing information. Another characteristic of life is that many life forms replicate in a way that mixes information with other members of that species. Now, what this says is sexual reproduction. Now, as Dr. Hoeksema will have explained, certain life forms can replicate without sexual reproduction, but most higher life forms use sexual reproduction as a way to mix and match genetic information, as a way to ensure better adaptation and evolution and success of members of that species. Also, all life forms use more or less the same elemental components, and which are actually similar, but not the same, but similar to the elements found in seawater. Now, there's some differences. Living cells contain a little bit more carbon. Remember, carbon is important because of its covalent chemistry and forming proteins and nucleic acids and lipids. There's relatively more carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, calcium, copper, and iron in living cells, and relatively less sodium and magnesium in living cells as compared to seawater. But by and large, the elemental components are similar to that found in our environment. So metabolism, the fact that all living cells, all life forms, are some type of chemical machine. Now, we know the sequence of reactions in metabolism for the most part. This was something that was discovered over the last 100 years or so, and we have metabolic charts that show a mapping of all of the chemical reactions in both catabolic and anabolic pathways. Now, are you ready to take some notes? You ready? Here we go. This sort of looks like the Google map of Washington, D.C. Let me check. Yeah, this is the metabolic pathway. I got the right file. So this is a metabolic chart. Now, of course, it's so small, it looks like an integrated circuit board or as I said, a Google map, because there's so much information that we know about the sequence of reactions that occur inside a cell. Now, this just shows them one going to another. Now, this is too much. This is too much for anyone to comprehend. But I'll show you another version of a metabolic chart, which has a little less information, but it's still very, very detailed, as you can see. And it shows the more important metabolic pathways. Now, one thing you'll notice, and you may have noticed it in the other one, is sort of this circle that you see kind of in the middle. And there's another one over on the right. And actually, both of these circles are attributed to a scientist named Hans Krebs. One is called the urea cycle, and the other is called the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. This diagram shows the complexity of metabolic reactions, again, only focusing on the more important ones, the more central ones. Now, when I was a graduate student in biochemistry, this is the kind of information that we had to understand. But let's cut to the chase and only look at that central part, what is called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. And we've talked about this a little bit before, I believe, in one of Dr. Hoeksema's lessons. Essentially, this shows that if we start with glucose, which is not even shown here, in which we metabolize glucose, which we may consume as a fuel molecule, we break it down to something called pyruvate and then acetyl-CoA, and it enters this cycle. And the purpose of this is to produce ATP. Now, in addition to producing ATP, this intermediary energy molecule, also metabolism forms NADH, and it would take us some time to explain that, but NADH is another important molecule which can be cashed in for ATP. Now, you may recall that at one point we talked about the internal combustion engine of automobiles and how they are based on a combustion reaction, or a reaction between oxygen and fuel molecules such as isooctane. Remember that? And that carbon dioxide and water vapor were the products, and that in doing so energy was released, and that energy was used to drive pistons up and down, which then turned the wheels. Okay? Energy used to do work. Well, in the metabolism of our bodies, something very similar happens, except that instead of having the reaction occur in one explosive reaction, as happens inside the pistons of an internal combustion engine, the reactions occur in a stepwise manner, such as we see in this slide and we saw in the previous two very detailed slides, that the breakdown of the molecules occurs stepwise. And in doing so, the energy is released in smaller packages, and also we can control the rates of these reactions. Now, Let me state that again. Each reaction in the metabolic pathways is catalyzed by an enzyme, which both speeds it up and also enables us to control the rate of the reaction. That is, to either slow it down or speed it up in order to coordinate reactions. Many of these enzymes are actually regulated by other complicated sequences involving proteins. There are approximately 10,000 to 30,000 different proteins in a living cell. Many of these, maybe half or so, are in the category called enzymes. This is typical for one of our cells, one of our eukaryotic cells. Now, from our understanding of metabolism, it can be said with certainty that living cells obey, in fact, they have to obey, the first and second law of thermodynamics. Remember those? The first law about the conservation of energy, or that energy was neither created or destroyed, but just was interconverted between forms. In the second law, there's always a degradation of energy into heat, or another way of stating this is that there's always an increase in the disorder of the universe, increase in entropy, when spontaneous reactions occur. Also, living cells have to deal with the hand that they're dealt. Now, what I mean by this is that living cells and multicellular organisms have to deal with their chemical environment, which could potentially include toxic chemicals, or a deficiency of nutrients, or extreme temperatures or pressures or pH. Some life forms can exist under conditions as extreme as pH 1, very acidic, or 180 degrees Fahrenheit, or very high salt concentrations, or very, very high pressures. Life can exist in all of these extreme conditions due to some type of adaptation. That leads to my final slide of this chapter, which says, and I'm sure you will agree now, life is complex, but also life is persistent. All right, this is the end of our fourth lesson on the chapter of biomolecules and biochemistry, and this will be our last lesson. We'll pause now to take a quiz, and then we'll move on to another chapter.